On a furious snowy night, Logan Hart stumbled upon an abandoned car deep in the forest. Inside, Rachel Moore trembled, clutching her two children, her eyes wide with despair as the hunter closed in. The howling wind merged with the pounding of hearts, and in a single moment, the destiny of 4 lives and 1 loyal dog was about to change forever. Hit subscribe now so you won't miss the gripping stories yet to come. The wind tore through the pines like a chorus of ghosts. A wild, relentless sound that seemed to scrape against bone and nerve. Silver Creek, Colorado lay buried under the white silence of a blizzard, so fierce it swallowed whole the shape of the world. Snow fell in thick swirling sheets, erasing the highway lines, burying the fences, turning cabins into nothing more than faint humps of shadow under the crushing drift. The town's few flickering lights were distant now, drowned beneath the storm's wrath, leaving only darkness, snow, and the howl of the wind. Logan Hart gripped the steering wheel of his black Ford Expedition, knuckles pale against the leather. The wipers beat furiously, smearing ice across the windshield, barely keeping pace with the onslaught of snow. His breath fogged the cab as he exhaled slowly, his jaw tense the same way it had been for years, locked tight as if emotion itself had no place in him anymore. He had been in storms before, both the kind that came from the sky and the kind that lived inside a man's chest, but this night carried a weight that settled heavy on his shoulders. Beside him, a German shepherd sat upright, posture rigid, as though carved from stone. Harry, his loyal partner, shifted slightly, eyes glowing in the faint dashlight, scanning the dark edges beyond the window. At 9 years old, Harry had the presence of a veteran soldier, every muscle tuned, every twitch of his ears deliberate. His muzzle had begun to gray, and there was a faint scar above his left eye, a mark from a past Logan never spoke of. But the dog's gaze remained sharp, unwavering, as if he alone could pierce through the veil of snow and see the truth beyond. The heater hummed softly, pushing back against the cold that seeped into the truck, but the warmth did nothing to ease the heaviness in Logan's chest. Nights like this had a way of stirring ghosts. 5 years had passed since the night the flames took everything he loved, his wife Anna, their unborn child, the life he had promised to protect. He had been an FBI agent, then chasing shadows across state lines, fighting battles most people never even knew existed. But none of it had prepared him for the moment he stood outside his burning home, screaming her name into smoke that swallowed every answer. Now, he was a different man. A man who had walked away from a badge and sworn never to believe in miracles again. Yet still he patrolled the back roads of Silver Creek, as if duty alone could keep his heart from turning to stone completely. Harry's sudden bark shattered the silence of the cab. It wasn't the sharp bark of excitement. It was low, urgent, a warning. Logan's hands tightened on the wheel. His eyes scanned the snow-smeared road ahead, then flicked to the shadows of the tree line. The headlights stretched only a few feet into the storm, cutting through the swirling white just enough to reveal a break in the trees. Something out there didn't belong. "What is it, boy?" Logan murmured, his voice gravel low and steady. Harry leaned forward, ears pricked, nose twitching against the glass. The bark came again, deeper now, followed by a whine that carried an edge of desperation. Logan slowed the truck, the tires crunching against packed snow, the beams of light catching on something metal. He narrowed his eyes. A vehicle, half buried under the drift, tilted, slightly abandoned. Logan killed the engine, the sudden silence roaring louder than the storm itself. He reached for the heavy-duty flashlight on the seat beside him, clipped it to his belt, and glanced at Harry. "Stay sharp." The dog's tail thumped once against the seat, as if in agreement. Together they stepped out into the storm. The wind slammed into Logan like a living thing, cold biting deep through his coat. He pulled the hood of his jacket tighter, boots crunching into the snow as he pushed forward. The abandoned vehicle was an older model sedan, its windows iced over the paint dulled by frost. The driver's door hung slightly open, snow piled against the threshold. Harry trotted ahead, nose close to the ground, then froze, muscles taut. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Logan raised the flashlight, its beam slicing through the swirl. He approached cautiously, one hand near the holster on his hip, the other steadying the light. The sedan loomed closer, its outline jagged against the white. And then, a sound, barely there at first, but distinct. A whimper, high-pitched, fragile, not the wind, not the storm, something human. Logan's pulse quickened. He stepped faster, Harry moving in sync beside him, every nerve in the air between them alive. He reached the car, pulled the door wide, and shined the beam inside. The sight froze him. In the back seat, a young woman curled tightly barefoot, her body trembling violently against the cold. Her arms wrapped desperately around 2 tiny bundles, each swaddled in scarves and thin towels, barely enough to ward off the freezing air. The children's faces were pale, their breaths shallow wisps of vapor against the dim light. The woman's eyes snapped open as the light found her wide with terror, pupils blown from fear. She gasped, lips cracked, voice ragged as she tried to push herself back against the seat. "Please, please don't take them," she whispered, words trembling through chattering teeth. "Just take me, not them." Logan's chest constricted. He dropped to one knee beside the open door, the beam steady on her face. "You're safe," he said softly. His tone low, firm, meant to anchor her through the chaos. "I'm not here to take anyone. My name's Logan Hart. I'm here to help." Harry stepped closer, lowering himself near the opening, eyes locked on the woman, but posture calm, steady. The children stirred faintly, one giving a weak cough. The sound pierced Logan deeper than the wind ever could. The woman's breaths came in shallow gasps, her body shaking under the thin layers she wore. She clutched the children tighter, as though sheer willpower might keep them alive. "What's your name?" Logan asked gently. Her lips trembled before the words slipped free, barely audible. "Rachel. Rachel Moore." Logan nodded once. "Rachel, listen to me. You and your babies can't stay here. You'll freeze. I'm getting you out." Her eyes glistened with tears that froze almost as quickly as they fell. She blinked hard, trying to form words, but her strength was waning. "Don't let him find us," she breathed, the whisper carried away by the wind. Logan's stomach tightened. He wanted to ask who. But one look at the bruises fading along her jawline, the thin red welts on her wrists, told him enough. Whoever she was running from, he was dangerous. He slipped out of his heavy coat, ignoring the rush of cold against his own skin, and wrapped it carefully around her and the children. "Stay with me," he urged. "I've got you now." Rachel's eyes fluttered, her grip on the children weakening as exhaustion overtook her. Logan leaned closer, steadying her arms around the babies, feeling the faint warmth of their tiny bodies against the chill. Harry whined, softly pressing his nose against the edge of the blanket, his breath warming the infant's cheeks. The wind howled louder, rattling branches above, a warning that time was running out. Logan gathered Rachel and the two children into his arms, lifting them as though they weighed nothing. Though the burden was heavy, with more than just flesh and bone. "Come on, boy," Logan muttered, his voice hoarse. Harry moved swiftly at his side as Logan carried them back through the storm toward the truck. The world blurred around him. Snow, wind, darkness, but his focus was unbreakable, locked on the fragile lives in his arms. By the time he reached the vehicle, Rachel's head had slumped against his chest, her breaths shallow but still there. The children whimpered faintly, clinging to warmth they barely had. Logan slid into the back seat, bundling them with every blanket he kept in the truck, his hands moving with the practiced urgency of a man who had saved lives before and lost them too. The engine roared to life, heater blasting. Harry settled at the foot of the back seat, pressing his body close to the bundles, eyes, sharp ears twitching at every sound beyond the storm. Logan glanced down at Rachel. Her lashes crusted with ice, her lips faintly blue. He brushed a strand of damp hair from her face, his chest aching at the sight. "You're safe now," he murmured again, though he wasn't sure if she could hear. Outside, the storm raged, relentless. But inside the cab of that black expedition, 3 fragile lives hung by a thread, and for the first time in years, Logan felt something stir in him. Not duty, not habit. Purpose. The truck shuddered as Logan pushed it through the curtain of snow tires grinding over the ice-crusted road. The headlights cut a narrow path into the storm, revealing nothing but blinding white ahead. Wind screamed against the metal, rattling the doors like invisible fists. Inside, the air was thick with tension, every breath visible in the freezing cab. Rachel stirred in the back seat, still wrapped in Logan's coat, her arms clutching the 2 tiny bundles like her life depended on it. Her lips parted and her voice came faint and broken. "Please," she whispered, barely audible over the howl of the wind. "Don't let him find us." Logan's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, catching the hollow desperation etched on her face. He wanted to promise her safety, to swear that no one would ever hurt her or the children again. But he knew better than to make promises he couldn't keep. Instead, he gave her the only thing he could. "He's not getting near you tonight," Logan said, his voice steady, cutting through the storm like a blade. Harry sat pressed against the seat beside the babies. His body curled protectively, tail tucked tight, ears pricked toward every sound beyond the storm. Every so often he let out a low whine, as if he too understood the fragile line they were walking. The miles stretched endlessly. The road that led to Logan's cabin was narrow, winding, half swallowed by drifts. Each turn felt like the world itself wanted to close in, to bury them alive beneath the avalanche of white. Logan's hands remained tight on the wheel, his knuckles pale, eyes sharp as he scanned for the landmarks he knew so well. The curve where the pines bent like arches, the slope where the guardrail had long since rusted away. Rachel shifted again. The movement was weak, her strength all but drained, but her grip on the children never loosened. One of them whimpered a soft sound, barely louder than the crackle of the heater. Logan glanced back, his chest aching at the sight of the small knitted hat slipping from the infant's head. With one hand still on the wheel, he reached back, steadying the blanket around the baby, tucking it closer to Harry's warm flank. "You hold on," Logan murmured softly, though he wasn't sure if the words were meant for the children, for Rachel, or for himself. The storm grew heavier as they climbed higher into the hills. Snow whipped across the windshield, each gust like a wall of white. The truck struggled, tires spinning once on a patch of ice before catching again. Logan leaned forward, urging it on. "Come on," he muttered through clenched teeth. At last, through the blur, a faint shape emerged ahead. A cabin. His cabin. A modest wooden structure built into the side of the hill, its roof bowed under the weight of snow. The chimney sent up a thin stream of smoke, proof the generator had done its work, keeping the place alive against the storm's assault. Relief settled in his chest, but only for a heartbeat. He knew safety was an illusion. Not with a woman like Rachel whispering fears into the dark. Not with someone hunting her so desperately she was hiding in an abandoned car in the middle of a blizzard. He pulled the truck up, close headlights washing over the cabin's cedar siding, then killed the engine. Silence surged in again, broken only by the roar of the wind. Logan turned to Rachel, whose eyes had fluttered, half-shut lashes crusted with ice. "Rachel," he said gently, "we're here." Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then finding his. She let out a breath that seemed to carry all the weight of the last hours. Tears streaked down her cheeks, freezing before they could fall. Logan opened the door. The storm slammed into him again, tearing at his jacket, biting into every inch of exposed skin. He didn't hesitate. He moved to the back, swinging the door open, crouching low against the wind. "I've got you," he told her. Without waiting for an answer, he scooped her and the babies into his arms, once more cradling them close against his chest. Rachel's head fell against his shoulder, her voice a fragile whisper lost in the storm. "Don't let him find us." Logan's jaw tightened. Not tonight. Harry leapt from the truck, bounding through the snow ahead, clearing a path with his broad chest. The dog's ears stood sharp against the gale, his body moving with the certainty of instinct. Logan followed, boots sinking deep into the drifts, every step a battle against the storm. The weight in his arms was heavy, but he held them as though the entire world depended on it. The cabin door came into view, half buried in snow. Logan kicked the drift aside, shoulders straining as he forced the lock open. The door groaned, then swung wide, and the sudden wash of warmth from inside rushed against his frozen face. He stepped in quickly, closing the door with a firm shove. The storm's howl dulled instantly, replaced by the crackle of the fire already burning in the stone hearth. The glow spread across the wooden walls, chasing shadows, wrapping the room in a fragile cocoon of light and heat. Logan lowered Rachel gently onto the couch, keeping the babies snug in her arms as he layered blankets over them. She let out a soft sob, clutching the children even closer, as if the mere act of letting them go might summon the very man she feared. "It's okay," Logan said, crouching in front of her, his eyes steady on hers. "You're safe here." Rachel shook her head, faintly, tears spilling despite her exhaustion. No one's ever safe from him." Harry patted over, circling once before settling against the couch. His body pressed against Rachel's legs, the warmth of his fur radiating toward the children. He laid his head gently against the blanket, sighing as if promising in his own silent way that he would not move, not for anything. Logan adjusted the fire, feeding it another log, until the flames rose higher, sending waves of heat into the room. He moved swiftly through the space, retrieving extra quilts from the chest against the wall, filling the kettle on the stove, checking the thermostat. The motions were mechanical, born of habit, but each one carried a weight he hadn't felt in years. When he returned to the couch, Rachel was staring down at the tiny faces nestled against her chest. Her lips trembled as she whispered something too faint for Logan to hear. He knelt beside her again. "What did you say?" She looked at him, eyes raw with exhaustion, fear, and something deeper, hope, so fragile it hurt to see. "I prayed that someone would come. Not for me, for them." Her voice cracked. "And you did." Logan's throat tightened, but he forced himself to hold her gaze. "Then let's make sure they live to see tomorrow." Rachel's eyes welled with fresh tears, and she nodded weakly. For a moment, the world seemed to still. The fire crackled, the storm howled beyond the walls, but inside that small cabin, warmth pressed back against the cold, fragile, yet defiant. Harry shifted, pressing closer to the babies, his steady breathing, a rhythm of calm against the chaos that had carried them here. Rachel reached down her trembling fingers, brushing over the dog's fur. He knows, she whispered softly, almost to herself. He knows who to trust. Logan glanced at Harry, then back at Rachel. Yeah, he always has. He settled back on his heels, exhaling slowly. For the first time in years, Logan felt the faintest flicker of something he hadn't dared believe in for a long time. Not just duty, not just survival. A reason. The fire had grown steady, throwing long shadows across the cabin walls, painting the wooden beams with flickering light. Outside, the storm continued to roar snow, battering the windows. But here within the cabin's fragile warmth, a stillness settled. It wasn't peace, not yet, but a pause, the kind that comes before the truth can no longer be contained. Rachel sat curled beneath layers of quilts on the couch. Her children cradled close to her chest. Their small breaths rose and fell against her body, soft reminders that for this moment at least, they were safe. Yet her eyes betrayed no calm. They darted occasionally toward the windows, as if she expected shadows to move there, expected footsteps to crunch through the snow outside. Logan watched her from the chair opposite, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped loosely. He had seen fear before on crime scenes, in interrogation rooms, even in his own reflection. But there was something raw in Rachel's gaze that cut deeper. This wasn't just fear of harm. It was fear of being erased. He cleared his throat softly, trying not to startle her. They're warmer now. You're warmer. Rachel nodded faintly, but didn't look up. Instead, she adjusted the blanket around her son's small face, her trembling fingers brushing the child's cheek as if to reassure herself he was real. Still breathing, Rachel, Logan said gently, his voice steady but insistent. I need to know what we're up against. You said, don't let him find us. Who are you talking about? Her body stiffened. For a long moment, she didn't answer. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the faint whistle of wind through the chimney. Harry lay near her feet, his head resting on his paws, ears twitching with every subtle change in her breathing. As though he could sense what was coming, Rachel's lips parted. The words didn't come at first, only a shallow breath. Then slowly she lifted her gaze to meet Logan's. Her eyes glistened in the firelight. Daniel Cross, she whispered, and the name itself seemed to drain the air from the room. Logan's expression shifted subtly, the way a soldier tenses at the sound of an approaching threat. He knew the name. Everyone in Colorado did. Daniel Cross was a man with headlines behind him, the kind who posed for magazine covers, shaking hands with governors, smiling for cameras, while breaking ground on luxury developments. He was the picture of success, wealth, philanthropy. But Logan had been in the bureau long enough to know that the more polished the surface, the darker the shadow beneath. Rachel's gaze didn't waver. He's my husband, she said, her voice trembling, as though the admission alone could summon him from the storm. Logan leaned forward slightly. Ex-husband? Her laugh was short, bitter. Not legally. He made sure of that. On paper, I'm still his. He says it keeps me obedient. The words hung heavy between them. Logan felt his jaw tighten, the old ache in his chest stirring. He had seen abusers before, men who treated women like possessions. But the calm desperation in Rachel's voice told him Daniel Cross was more than that. He was dangerous in ways that went far beyond fists and words. Rachel, Logan said carefully, what exactly did he do? Her fingers trembled against the baby's blanket. She drew in a shaky breath, staring not at Logan, but at the fire, as if the flames could burn away the images behind her eyes. He has money, more than anyone should. Properties across states, shell companies. No one can trace politicians who smile when he walks into a room. But it's not just money. It's power. He built an empire, Logan, not just of buildings and deals, but of people. Her voice faltered, then hardened. He buys them, uses them, and when they're no longer useful, they disappear. Logan said nothing. He let her speak, knowing the weight of silence sometimes carried more strength than interruption. Rachel's throat worked as she swallowed. I didn't see it at first. He was charming. He made me feel like I was the only one who mattered. I was young, stupid. By the time I realized what he was, I was already trapped. Her eyes flicked down to the babies, tears brimming. When I got pregnant, I thought it would change him. I thought maybe he'd finally love something enough to stop. Logan's chest tightened. He'd heard the same hope from so many women who had clung to the idea of transformation that never came. Rachel's voice dropped to a whisper. I was wrong. He didn't want them. Said they were a liability. Said children ruined legacies. Her shoulders shook. When the twins were born, I saw him looking at them like they were assets, not children. not mine. Just tools for him to trade. Logan felt the air leave his lungs. He straightened, his hands tightening together. What are you saying? Rachel looked at him. Then her eyes hollow, her lips trembling as the truth broke free. He was going to sell them. The words fell like a hammer-sharp final cutting through the warmth of the fire. Logan's blood went cold. Sell them! Her nod was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. I overheard a call. He thought I was asleep. Some kind of deal with a man overseas. He said the twins would disappear. It would cover a transfer something to keep an investigation off his back. He was laughing, Logan. Laughing while he planned to hand them over. Her tears spilled then, streaming silently down her cheeks as she pressed her lips to the top of her daughter's tiny head. I couldn't wait anymore. I had to run. For the first time in years, Logan felt his hands shake. He sat back, exhaling hard, trying to anchor himself. He'd faced terrorists, organized crime men who killed without blinking. But the idea of a father plotting to trade his own children like currency clawed at something raw in him. He forced his voice steady. Rachel, listen to me. You did the right thing. You got them out. Her head shook violently. He'll find us. He always finds me. I've tried before. Shelters, motels, hiding with friends. He sends people. He pays them. Her voice cracked. He'll never stop. Harry let out a soft growl. His body shifting closer to the couch, eyes fixed on Rachel, as if to say he'd heard her fear and shared it. Logan leaned forward again, his gaze locking with hers. His voice dropped low, deliberate avow forged in steel. Then let him come. Rachel blinked, startled, as if unsure she'd heard him right. Logan's jaw tightened, his eyes storm gray and unflinching. If he wants to get near you or those kids, he'll have to go through me first. And I don't care who he is, how much money he has, or what kind of empire he's built. He won't touch you. Not while I'm breathing. Rachel stared at him, tears glistening, searching for a crack in his resolve. She found none. Why, she whispered. Logan paused, the weight of the question pressing against the old scars in his chest. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then softly he said, because someone should have helped you a long time ago. And because I know what it's like to lose a family. Her lips trembled, the tears spilling faster now. She lowered her gaze, pressing a kiss to her son's forehead, clutching both children tighter, as though Logan's words had given her permission to believe for the first time in years that they might survive this. The fire cracked loudly, startling her for an instant, but Logan didn't move. His eyes never left hers. You're not alone anymore, Rachel, he said firmly. Not now. Not ever again. Harry shifted closer, resting his head gently against her knee-eyes, watchful body warm against her trembling frame. Rachel's hand moved shakily, brushing through the thick fur, and for the first time since Logan had found her, a faint, fragile whisper of relief softened her expression. The storm still howled outside, a relentless beast battering the cabin walls. But inside, a vow had been spoken, one that would change the course of every life in the room. The storm had eased, but only on the surface. Outside, the night had grown quieter, the snowfall lighter, yet the silence carried a weight that made Logan's skin prickle. It was the kind of silence that didn't soothe, but warned. A predator's silence. The fire crackled inside the cabin, casting shifting bands of light across Rachel's pale face. Her children slept against her chest, their breaths small, fragile puffs of life. She hadn't moved from the couch. Harry stirred first. His ears snapped forward, head lifting slowly from his paws. A low growl rumbled in his chest, deep and steady. His body stiffened, tail low, every muscle coiled. Logan froze mid-step, coffee mug still in hand. He followed the dog's gaze toward the frosted window. Beyond the glass, the moonlight muted by the storm's remnants painted the world in shades of silver and shadow. At first Logan saw nothing. Then his eyes narrowed. Tracks. Faint impressions half covered in new snow weaving through the trees and circling near the cabin's porch. The breath in his lungs turned heavy sharp. He set the mug down without a sound, crossing the room with quiet precision. His fingers brushed the rifle resting by the door, an old Winchester he kept loaded for coyotes, though he suddenly knew tonight it might need to do more. He glanced back at Rachel. She hadn't noticed yet. She sat with her head bowed, one hand absently stroking her daughter's cheek, lost in a moment that hadn't caught up to the present danger. Harry's growl deepened, ears pinned, now eyes like slivers of steel. Stay with them, Logan whispered to the dog, as though Harry could understand the command, as well as any human partner. The shepherd gave a single thump of his tail, then shifted to press himself tighter against Rachel's legs, guarding without hesitation. Logan pulled on his jacket, the heavy weight of leather cold against his arms, The air outside was knife-sharp when he stepped onto the porch, the kind of cold that burned the lungs. His boots sank into the snow, each step deliberate, controlled. He crouched low, flashlight beam, slicing across the drifts. The tracks were fresh. Too fresh. They cut across the yard, pausing near the window before disappearing into the tree line. Whoever had been there had stopped long enough to look in. Logan's pulse hammered, but his face remained impassive. He followed the tracks a few feet, scanning the ground with the eye of a man who had once hunted killers across state lines. The prints were heavy, deliberate, not the casual marks of a hiker. He counted at least 2 sets. One larger boot prints deep from weight, another lighter but spaced wide apart. Someone agile, experienced. Then he saw it half buried under a thin crust of ice, metal glinting faintly in the moonlight. He crouched, brushing snow aside. A casing, spent. The brass chilled his fingers instantly. He turned it over in his palm jaw, tightening. .45 caliber. Not fired here recently. No smell of powder, but placed. Left behind as a message, maybe. A warning. He slipped it into his pocket, scanning the shadows again. That was when his eyes caught something on the truck. At first glance, it looked like nothing. Just another frost-covered edge near the undercarriage. But Logan had been trained too long, had lived through too much to miss the unnatural. He knelt, flashlight beam steady, and his stomach dropped. A tracker, small black magnet mounted, blinking faintly with a pulse of red under the ice. He cursed under his breath, ripping it free with one sharp pull. The cold metal bit into his hand, but the chill in his chest was worse. They knew. They had known exactly where Rachel was. The forest whispered, branches creaking under the weight of ice. And then, a voice. It came low, smooth, carried just enough by the still air to reach him. From somewhere beyond the tree line. Rachel? The sound was almost tender, drawn out like a lover's call. You can't hide from me. Logan's grip tightened on the tracker, his other hand brushing the butt of the pistol at his side. His eyes scanned the tree line, searching for movement. The shadows danced, but nothing solid appeared. Still, the voice was unmistakable, close enough to crawl under the skin. You think some washed-up agent and his mutt can keep you safe? The voice drawled colder now. You belong to me. Logan's pulse roared in his ears, but his face stayed carved from stone. He stepped back toward the cabin, slowly, silently, never turning his back to the trees. His breath fogged in quick, sharp bursts. The snow beneath his boots groaned louder than he wanted. He cursed inwardly, but kept moving steady, deliberate the way he had in firefights before, never letting the enemy hear fear. Harry barked suddenly from inside, sharp. Fierce, the kind of sound that said he'd caught a scent. Rachel's gasp followed, muffled but frantic. Logan reached the porch, stepping inside quickly and bolting the door. The warmth hit him again, but it did nothing to ease the ice in his chest. Rachel's eyes found him instantly wide, terrified. What is it? Logan held up the tracker, its faint red pulse flickering like a heartbeat in the dim light. Her face drained of color. They know, she whispered, clutching her children tighter. He crouched in front of her voice, steady eyes locked on hers. They're close, but they're not getting in here. Tears filled her eyes, trembling as she pressed her lips against her daughter's hair. He'll never stop. Logan leaned closer, lowering his voice until it was a vow etched into the air between them. Then I'll never stop either. And I don't care what it costs me, Rachel. I'll keep you and those kids safe, even if it means my life. Harry pressed against Logan's side, now ears pinned. Body tense, eyes blazing toward the window. The growl in his throat carried the same promise his partner had just spoken aloud. Outside, the night pressed closer. Footsteps crunched faintly in the snow, circling. The cabin walls groaned under the weight of wind. And something else, danger patient and waiting. Logan rose slowly, his hand on the rifle by the door, his eyes sharp. He knew this wasn't the end of the storm. It was only the beginning, and he'd be ready. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the storm had slowed to a whisper, but danger didn't need snow to move. It moved on silence, on shadows, on the faint crunch of boots pressing into frozen earth. Logan stood by the window, rifle tight in his grip. Harry's growl vibrating low at his side. The dog's ears were pinned forward, eyes unblinking, muscles coiled like steel springs. Rachel had already obeyed his whispered command. She and the twins were hidden in the reinforced crawl space behind the bedroom closet. He could still see her face in the dim lantern glow before he closed the panel. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Please come back." Now he was alone. A sharp sound broke the stillness, the faint crack of wood near the back door. Logan's breath slowed. He moved soundlessly across the cabin, rifle held low, eyes cutting through the dim. Then it came again, this time louder. The whine of hinges. the unmistakable scrape of metal against metal. Someone was trying the lock. Harry barked once sharp, the warning of a sentinel. Logan raised a hand, steadying him. "Easy," he whispered. But his eyes told a different story. He knew it was about to begin. The lock gave with a muffled snap. The door swung an inch. Logan shifted to the blind spot of the entryway, rifle-angled body pressed against the wall. A breath. 2. The door burst open. The first man stepped in, fast knife glinting in his right hand. His face was masked breath, clouding the air in heavy bursts. He didn't see the blur of muscle and fur that lunged from the shadows. Harry hit him like a thunderbolt. The shepherd's jaws clamped on the attacker's wrist, the knife clattering to the wooden floor. The man screamed, twisting, but Harry was relentless, teeth-locked growl, vibrating through the cabin walls. Logan didn't wait. He moved. The second man was right behind the first, heavier, armed with a crowbar. Logan surged forward, disarming him in a single brutal motion, the metal weapon crashing against the floorboards. A punch followed sharp, precise, striking the man's jaw with the kind of force honed from years of FBI close-quarter combat. The intruder stumbled back, dazed, but not down. He swung blindly, fist grazing Logan's cheek. Logan grunted, blocked the next strike, and drove his elbow into the man's ribs. The attacker crumpled, gasping for air, just as Harry dragged the first one to the ground, teeth still sunk into flesh. A third shadow moved in the doorway. This one had a gun. Logan reacted before thought. He grabbed the crowbar, hurling it across the room with a soldier's precision. It struck the intruder's wrist, the pistol flying from his grasp. Logan lunged, slamming him against the wall, one forearm crushing across his throat. The cabin erupted in chaos. The babies stirred faintly behind the crawlspace door. Rachel's muffled sob caught in the stillness as she clutched them tighter, her whispered prayer shaking the air between her and God. "Please," she begged silently, tears streaking her face. "Don't let him find us." The first attacker screamed again, blood dripping from his wrist under Harry's iron bite. "Get him off, get him off." Logan barked the command. "Out." Harry released instantly, but stayed poised, teeth bared, a living wall between the intruder and the crawl space. The man clutched his arm, panting, eyes wide with fear. Logan pressed the third attacker harder against the wall, his voice low, deadly calm. "Who sent you?" The man's breath hitched, his eyes darting. Logan shoved harder. "Talk. Now." From the floor, the wounded man gasped, voice breaking under pain. "It was Daniel. He's paying anyone who brings her back." "And the kids." Rachel's muffled sob broke louder this time from the hidden crawl space. Logan's chest burned with rage. "How much?" "Doesn't matter," the attacker wheezed. "Enough to make men kill for it." The man in Logan's grip tried to twist free. Logan's forearm dug deeper into his throat, the voice choking off. "You tell me where he is, or you won't leave this cabin breathing." The intruder's eyes widened, panic breaking through bravado. His lips stammered. "He's in town. Missoula safe house. He sent us tonight to grab her quiet. No cops." Logan's eyes flicked to Harry. The shepherd stood like a statue, chest heaving, ready for another command. Rachel's muffled whisper carried through the panel. "Logan." He glanced back, softening his tone for a split second. "Stay with the kids. Don't open the door." Then he turned back, eyes cold again. "Tell Daniel this," he growled into the attacker's ear. "He'll have to step over my dead body to touch them." He shoved the man hard to the ground. The intruder coughed, clutching his throat, gasping for air. The one Harry had bitten lay groaning, blood soaking through his sleeve. Logan moved fast. He bound the second attacker's hands with cord from the gear chest, kicking the fallen pistol out of reach. The third one tried to crawl toward the door. "Don't," Logan warned, and the man froze. The cabin's silence returned slowly, broken only by Rachel's sobs from behind the hidden panel and the crackle of fire that hadn't dimmed through the chaos. Logan stood over the bound intruder chest, heaving rifle still tight in his grip. His cheek burned from the earlier hit, blood pulsing in his ears. He wasn't shaken, not outwardly, but his jaw clenched with fury. Daniel had crossed a line, sending men into a storm, into this sanctuary, to rip a mother from her children. Logan crouched low, his voice lethal calm. "You go back and tell him this. The game's changed. She's not alone anymore. And neither are those kids." The man's eyes widened. He nodded frantically. Okay. Logan rose, stepping back, glancing toward the closet door where Rachel waited. He could almost feel her trembling on the other side. Harry moved, first padding to the door, laying his head against it with a soft whine, as if to tell her it was safe now. Logan exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing deep into his chest. He knew this was only the first assault. The storm had broken inside the cabin now, and Daniel Cross wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted. But Logan had made a vow, And tonight, he'd proved he meant it. The cabin still smelled of sweat and gunpowder. The fire had burned low, its embers pulsing faintly like a dying heartbeat. The two intruders Logan had incapacitated were gone now, handed over quietly to Sheriff Langston's men who had slipped through the back roads under cover of the storm. But the silence that returned wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that told Logan the real fight hadn't even started. Rachel sat slumped on the couch, the quilts wrapped around her trembling frame. Her children nestled against her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from tears that hadn't stopped since the men had broken into the cabin. She hadn't spoken since. Harry lay curled protectively at her feet, his ears twitching at every creak of the cabin walls, his eyes burning with the same vigilance Logan felt in his chest. Logan sat at the desk in the adjoining room, the glow of his laptop casting sharp lines across his scarred face. His fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, eyes narrowing as screen after screen lit up with files, databases, encrypted emails, some he hadn't opened in years. He had sworn he was done with this life after leaving the bureau, sworn to bury his badge and the ghosts that came with it. But tonight he had no choice. The secure call connected the familiar voice on the other end, pulling him back to a past he thought he'd left behind. "Logan Hart," the voice said gravely with age, layered with suspicion. "Been a long time." Logan leaned forward, lowering his tone. "Frank. I wouldn't call if it wasn't life or death." Frank Mallory had once been his partner in the bureau, a man who'd seen the same dark corners of humanity Logan had. A man who understood what it meant to stare into the abyss and not blink. "Tell me you didn't go back in," Frank muttered. "I didn't. Trouble found me." Logan's eyes flicked toward the living room, where Rachel clutched her children like a lifeline. "I need intel. Fast." A pause crackled over the line. "Who's after you?" "Daniel Cross." The silence on the other end was longer this time. Then Frank's voice dropped to a growl. "You just stepped into hell, brother." Logan's jaw tightened. "I need everything you've got. Who he's working with, where his money's going, how far his reach is." "You sure you want the truth?" Frank asked. "Because once I tell you, there's no walking away." Logan's gaze hardened. "I'm not walking away." Keys clacked faintly on the other end of the line. Frank's voice grew low, urgent. "He's bigger than you think, Logan. Cross doesn't just have money. He has a network, private contractors, ex-military traffickers. He's tied to a shell company that moves millions offshore every quarter. And get this, some of those funds trace back to campaign contributions. Big ones. Senators, state officials. He's not just buying guns, he's buying protection." Logan's chest burned. "You're telling me he's got politicians on his payroll?" "And cops," Frank said grimly. "I see names here that make me sick. Detectives who should have put him away years ago. They didn't because they were on his take." Logan's hand curled into a fist against the desk. "So that's why every time Rachel ran, he found her." "You bet your life it is." He didn't need to look far. He had badges pointing the way. Logan's jaw flexed as he glanced toward the living room. Rachel had her eyes closed now, forehead pressed against her son's soft hair, tears still streaking down her cheeks. She looked small, broken in the dim light, and yet the way her arms clutched her children screamed of a strength forged in fire. Frank's voice sharpened. "Listen, Logan, this isn't a runaway case. Cross is desperate. That makes him dangerous. He's got enough dirt on the people backing him that if he goes down, he'll drag them with him. That's why he'll stop at nothing to get those kids back. Their leverage. And you," Frank's voice hesitated. "You're the only thing standing in his way." Logan's eyes narrowed. "Then I'll make sure I'm a wall he can't break." "Careful," Frank warned. "Walls fall if they're hit hard enough." Logan ended the call without another word. He didn't need more warnings. He already knew the storm had only just begun. He shut the laptop and moved quietly into the living room. The wood floor creaked softly under his boots, but Rachel didn't look up. She sat with her knees drawn to her chest, the twins nestled between them, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He crouched down in front of her, his voice low but firm. "Rachel." Her head lifted slowly. Her eyes were red, her lashes wet. "It doesn't matter, Logan," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You heard them. He has everything. Money, power, the law on his side. We'll never get away." Logan's chest ached at the hollow despair in her tone. He reached out, taking her hand gently, his calloused palm warm against her trembling fingers. She flinched at first, then let her grip settle into his. "Listen to me," he said softly, his storm-gray eyes locking with hers. "You've been running so long you don't remember what it feels like to stand. But I'm telling you now, we're not running anymore." Rachel shook her head, fresh tears sliding down her cheeks. "He'll kill you. He'll kill us all. Logan's grip tightened, his voice steady as steel. Then he'll have to try. But we're done hiding. We're done letting him decide who lives in fear. From this moment on, Rachel, we fight. Her lips parted, trembling, as if the very word had broken something in her chest. Fight? Yes. Logan's jaw set. Not just for you, not just for them. He nodded toward the twins. For every woman he's silenced, for every family he's destroyed, for every child he's treated like currency, we're going to bring him down. Her breath hitched, a sob escaping as she covered her mouth with her free hand. The idea was almost too big, too dangerous. But as Logan's words sank in, something shifted in her eyes. Not belief. Not yet. But a spark. The faintest ember of hope. You can't promise that, she whispered. Logan leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper, fierce and unwavering. I don't make promises I can't keep. Harry pressed against Rachel's legs, then his muzzle lifting to rest gently against her arm, as if lending his strength to Logan's vow. She looked down at the dog, her trembling fingers brushing through his thick fur. I'm so tired, she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know if I have anything left to fight with. Logan's hand slid gently up her arm, steadying her. Then lean on me until you do. Her tears fell silently, but she didn't pull away this time. She held his gaze, the storm in her eyes, meeting the fire in his. For a moment, the cabin, the storm, the danger outside, all of it faded. And there was only the quiet promise between two broken people daring to stand against a man who believed he couldn't be touched. Logan rose finally, his voice steady, commanding. Get some rest. Tomorrow we start preparing. If he wants a war, we'll give him one. Rachel looked down at her children, brushing a hand gently across Ava's small forehead, then back up at Logan. Her voice was faint, but steadier now. Then I'll fight too. Logan gave a single nod, the faintest trace of something like relief softening the hard lines of his face. Good. Because you're not alone anymore. Outside, the wind shifted, whispering through the trees like a warning. The tracks left behind by the intruders had already begun to fill with fresh snow, as though the night itself tried to erase their presence. But Logan knew better. The footprints were just the beginning. The storm had returned with vengeance. The cabin that had sheltered them hours ago was no longer safe. Logan knew the intruders' retreat was temporary. Daniel Cross's men would come back, and next time they wouldn't just test the door, they'd burn the place down if they had to. So when the moon hung faint behind storm clouds and the snow whispered against the windows, Logan made the call. We leave now, he said, pulling the heavy pack from the corner. His voice was firm, brooking no argument. Rachel's arms tightened instinctively around the twins. Through the storm, she whispered, disbelief and fear tangled in her tone. Logan's eyes were steady, his words blunt. Through the storm is the only way they won't track us. The snow will cover our trail. If we wait until morning, we're dead. Harry was already at the door. Tail low, ears pricked as though he'd understood the command long before Rachel had. Rachel hesitated, then looked at her children. Ava stirring softly against her chest, Aiden's tiny fingers curling around the fabric of her coat. She exhaled shakily, nodding once. Okay. Just don't let me fall. Logan's gaze softened for a brief second. I won't. The wind knifed into them the moment the door opened. Snowflakes stung like shards of glass, the world reduced to white and shadow. Logan moved first, his boots crunching into the drifts, carving a path that Rachel followed closely. Clutching the twins against her chest, beneath the thick blanket he'd wrapped around them. Harry led the way, his body low, ears cutting through the storm like radar. He stopped every few feet, sniffing the air, scanning the tree line. The dog's presence was more than comforting. It was vital. In the frozen wilderness, Harry was their compass, their sentinel, their warning bell. The cold was merciless. Rachel's breath came in sharp bursts, each one frosting the air before vanishing. Her boots slipped against the crusted snow, her legs trembling under the weight of fear and exhaustion. Logan's hand shot back every few steps, steadying her without a word, his grip strong and grounding. Minutes stretched into hours, though the clock hadn't yet moved that far. The forest groaned under the storm trees, bowing, snow whipping sideways. Then the faint sound of water reached Logan's ears. Not running water, it was frozen solid. But he knew the shift in the land, the way the ground dipped, and the silence of the storm echoed differently. A river. He held up a hand, halting Rachel. She blinked through the snow lips, trembling. What is it? River crossing, he said, scanning ahead. Frozen, but not all the way. We'll move quick. Stay right behind me. She swallowed hard, glancing down at the bundle in her arms. If the ice, I won't let it. Logan cut in his tone, brooking no space for panic. He adjusted the pack on his back, then stepped carefully onto the frozen surface. The ice groaned under his weight, a deep, threatening creak that made Rachel's stomach lurch. Harry trotted ahead, paws, light ears, flicking nervously. He turned back once, barking low as if to hurry them along. Rachel stepped onto the ice, her legs wobbling. The cold beneath her feet felt alive, a predator waiting to drag her under. She tightened her grip on the twins, each step, careful shallow breaths spilling from her lips. Halfway across it happened. Her boots slid. She gasped, her body pitching sideways. The world tilted, the sound of cracking ice splitting the air. Logan. His hand shot out faster than thought. He grabbed her wrist, yanking her hard against him. Her chest slammed into his. The twins pressed safe between them as his other arm wrapped around her waist. The ice beneath her cracked wider, but held. Her eyes were wide tears mingling with the snow on her lashes. I told you, Logan said, voice low but fierce. I won't let you fall. For a moment they stayed there, pressed together in the howling dark. His grip steady, her breath trembling against his chest. Then he eased her upright, guiding her step by step until the far bank rose before them. Harry barked once from the other side, tail whipping anxiously, as if urging them to hurry. The last step was the hardest, but they made it. Rachel collapsed onto the snow, clutching the twins, close tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Logan crouched beside her, scanning the river behind them. Their tracks were already vanishing under the relentless snow. We're clear, he murmured, for now. Harry trotted up, pressing his muzzle against Rachel's arm. She stroked his fur with trembling fingers, whispering, Good boy. Thank you. The shepherd licked her wrist once before turning his gaze back to Logan, eyes sharp, ears twitching toward the mountainside. Logan followed the dog's stare. The storm had carved shadows against the ridge, and within them, he spotted a narrow break in the rock face half hidden by snowdrifts. A cave. Shelter. This way, he said, already moving. Rachel pushed herself to her feet, her body aching, her soul frayed, but she followed. Harry led them straight to the mouth of the cave, his paws sinking deep into the snow, his breath puffing like smoke. Inside the cave was shallow but deep enough to break the wind. Logan dropped his pack, striking a flare against the rock wall. The flame hissed to life, bathing the stone in flickering red light. He quickly built a small fire, coaxing the kindling to catch the smoke curling upward into the cracks above. The warmth spread slowly, fighting back the icy grip that had wrapped itself around Rachel's bones. She lowered herself onto a flat rock, the twins bundled tight against her, watching the fire with wide, tired eyes. Their small faces glowed in the light, fragile but alive. Logan sat across from her, his expression unreadable in the fire's glow. For a long while they were silent, the crackle of flames, the only sound. Harry curled near the cave's entrance head, resting on his paws, eyes still fixed on the outside world. Rachel's voice broke the silence, soft and tentative. You said once, you know what it means to lose a family. Logan's gaze dropped to the fire. The light etched shadows across his jaw, hard lines carved by years of grief. His chest rose and fell slowly, like a man deciding whether to open a wound long sealed shut. Finally, his voice came low and steady. Her name was Claire, my wife. His eyes flicked up briefly, meeting Rachel's. She was pregnant, 8 months. I was supposed to be home that night. Instead, I was chasing a lead on a trafficking case. Rachel's breath caught softly. When I got back, the house was gone. Fire. Electrical short, they said. But it didn't matter. By the time I made it through the smoke, his voice cracked just faintly before he swallowed hard. They were gone. Silence settled heavy between them. Rachel's tears welled again, spilling before she could stop them. She whispered, Logan, I'm so sorry. His eyes stayed fixed on the fire. Since that night, I told myself I'd never let anyone close again. Not friends, not family. I didn't deserve it, and I sure as hell couldn't protect it. He shook his head once. Then I found you, hiding in that car, holding on like the world wanted to tear you apart. Rachel's breath trembled as she wiped her cheeks with the back of her sleeve. She leaned forward slightly, her voice breaking. You did protect us. Tonight, on that ice, back at the cabin. You're the reason we're still breathing. Logan looked at her finally, his storm gray eyes raw, unguarded. What if it's not enough? Her hand reached across the flames, trembling but determined. She touched his, the warmth of her fingers searing against his calloused skin. Then we fall together. But we don't stop fighting. For the first time in years, something shifted in Logan's chest. Not the crushing weight of grief. Something smaller, softer. A fragile thread of hope. Harry lifted his head, ears twitching, eyes flicking between the two of them as though he understood the gravity of the moment. The fire cracked sparks spiraling upward. Outside, the storm still raged. But in that cave, for the first time since it began, the cold didn't feel invincible. The fire in the cave had burned down to glowing coals, and the sound of crunching footsteps shattered the fragile calm. Logan's head snapped up instantly. His hand closed around the pistol lying beside him, body tense, eyes narrowing into the dark entrance. Harry was already on his feet, hackles bristling, a low growl vibrating from deep in his chest. Rachel froze, clutching Ava and Aiden tighter against her chest, her breath caught in her throat. Then a voice called softly, hesitant, almost familiar. "Logan, that you in there?" The tone disarmed Rachel for a split second, but Logan didn't relax. His stance only grew sharper, finger brushing the trigger guard. The figure stepped into the faint light. Snow dusted his shoulders, and a weathered face emerged, Mark Danner. Logan exhaled slowly, recognition flashing through his storm-gray eyes. "Mark." Rachel blinked, confused. "You know him?" "Old bureau," Logan said tightly. His tone didn't soften. "What the hell are you doing here?" Mark raised his hands in a show of peace, lips tugging into a weary half-smile. "Relax, brother. I heard about what went down in Redwood Valley. Word spreads fast. Figured you'd need backup." Logan's eyes flicked to Rachel, still clutching the twins, then back to Mark. He didn't lower the gun. "No one just figures where I am. How'd you find us? How'd you—" Mark chuckled softly, shaking snow from his coat. "Still suspicious as ever. I tracked Chatter. Saw your name linked with Cross on the deep boards. Knew you'd be in the line of fire. I'm here to help." Rachel's eyes darted between them. She wanted desperately to believe him. Anyone willing to stand on their side was a miracle. But Logan's face stayed carved in stone. Harry growled again, louder this time, stepping closer to Mark, teeth flashing in the firelight. Logan's instincts screamed. He lowered the gun fractionally, but stepped forward, eyes locking on Mark's hands. "Show me." What Mark asked, feigning confusion. "Your hands, both of them, slow." Mark hesitated. "Just long enough." Logan's stomach dropped. In a single motion, he lunged forward, grabbing Mark's wrist and wrenching his coat open. A small metallic click echoed. His eyes dropped, and there it was. A blinking red light no bigger than a coin, tucked inside the inner pocket of Mark's jacket. A tracker. Logan's blood iced over. His voice dropped to a lethal whisper. "What the hell did you do?" Mark's face twitched, the mask slipping. "You think you can hide her forever?" Cross has eyes everywhere. "This way, at least you get out alive." Rachel gasped, her arms tightening around the twins. "You betrayed us," Rachel, Mark said quickly, his tone suddenly oily, coaxing. "He can't protect you. Cross only wants the kids. Hand them over, and you'll live." The sound of Logan's fist cracking against Mark's jaw cut the words short. Mark staggered, blood spattering against the cave wall. Logan's voice thundered through the cave. "Get out before I end this right here." But it was too late. From outside, faint but unmistakable, came the crunch of multiple boots in the snow, dozens. Rachel's face went white. Logan's gut clenched. They'd been found. Harry barked once, sharp and urgent, then bolted to the cave mouth. Logan's voice cut through the chaos. "Grab the kids. We move now." Rachel didn't hesitate. She wrapped Ava tighter against her chest, secured Aiden in the sling. Her body trembling as adrenaline surged through her veins. Logan hauled the pack onto his shoulders, shoved Rachel toward the rear of the cave, where a narrow crack in the stone led to the open forest. Harry darted ahead, ears flat, guiding them through the jagged rocks into the howling blizzard beyond. Behind them, Mark's voice echoed faintly, panicked now. "They're heading out the back." Then the gunfire started. The sharp crack of bullets split the night, ricocheting off stone, sending chips of rock raining down. Rachel screamed, ducking instinctively as Logan threw himself behind her, his body shielding her and the children. "Move!" Logan barked, his hand firm on her shoulder, propelling her forward through the snowdrifts. The forest erupted in chaos. Shadows darted between the trees, beams of flashlights slicing through the storm. The hunters were closing in. Rachel's heart pounded so hard, she thought her chest would split. Her breath burned her legs, threatened to give out, but she kept moving, driven by the desperate need to keep her children alive. Harry charged ahead, then suddenly veered left, barking furiously. Logan followed, pulling Rachel down behind a fallen pine as a bullet ripped through the air where her head had been seconds earlier. "Stay down," he hissed, firing 2 controlled shots into the dark. A cry rang out. One of the hunters had fallen, but there were more. Too many. Rachel clutched her children, tears freezing on her cheeks, whispering frantic prayers under her breath. Ava whimpered softly, her tiny voice piercing the storm, while Aiden clung silently, wide-eyed with fear. Then it happened. One of the hunters broke through the trees, lunging toward Rachel with a knife glinting in the flashlight beam. She screamed, and Harry launched himself like a missile. The dog collided with the man mid-stride, teeth sinking into his arm. The knife clattered into the snow as Harry dragged him down, snarling with a fury Rachel had never heard before. The man shouted in pain, his other hand fumbling for a pistol. Logan fired once clean, precise. The man went still, but Harry yelped, stumbling back, blood staining the snow near his flank. No, Rachel gasped, reaching toward him. Harry shook himself, standing unsteady, but refusing to back down. His eyes burned with defiance, even as his body trembled. "Go," Logan shouted. "He's fine, move." They ran again, the storm clawing at their faces, the snow deep and merciless. Every step felt like pushing through concrete. Logan's lungs burned, his heart pounding like war drums. Then Rachel froze, her breath catching in her throat. Through the blur of snow and shadow, a figure stood at the far edge of the clearing. Tall, still, unmoving. Daniel Cross. Even through the storm, she knew those eyes. Cold, calculating, a predator savoring the chase. Her voice tore from her throat, ragged and desperate. "It's him." Logan turned sharply, eyes narrowing as he spotted the silhouette. The world seemed to constrict, every sound fading except the roar of blood in his ears. Daniel didn't move. He only watched, his lips curving into the faintest smile, as though the entire nightmare had been orchestrated for this exact moment. Logan's grip tightened on his weapon. "Keep running," he growled to Rachel, never taking his eyes off the man in the storm. Rachel's heart pounded, her body frozen between terror and the will to protect her children. She looked at Logan, saw the unshakable fire in his eyes, and forced her legs to move. She clutched the twins tighter, her tears mixing with the snow. The chase had only just begun. The climb was merciless. The storm had weakened, but the cold still clung to every breath, every step. Logan pressed forward, breaking the path through snow that reached nearly to his knees, his rifle slung across his back. Behind him, Rachel struggled under the weight of exhaustion, but her grip on the twins never faltered. Frank Miller's hideout was near the summit of a ridge that overlooked Silver Creek like a silent sentinel. It wasn't on any map. Only Logan and a handful of men who'd once bled beside Frank knew it even existed. Harry trotted a few paces ahead, limping, but determined, his breath fogging the bitter air. His ears twitched constantly, eyes sweeping every shadow as if daring any threat to come closer. Rachel's legs shook violently, each step dragging. She whispered hoarsely, "How much farther?" "Close," Logan said without looking back. His voice was low but firm, a steady anchor against the chaos swirling in her chest. "Another quarter mile. You can make it." She nodded, though her body screamed in protest. The twins stirred softly beneath the blanket, and Rachel bent her head, whispering to them through clenched teeth. "Just a little longer, babies. Just a little longer." Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, Logan lifted his hand. There. Through the curtain of trees half buried in snow and stone sat what looked like a cabin. But as they drew closer, Rachel realized it was more fortress than home. Reinforced logs. Steel shutters bolted over the windows. A narrow chimney barely visible against the mountain rock. It looked like it had been carved straight from the earth itself. The door creaked open before Logan even knocked. A man stepped into the light, tall and broad-shouldered, his face lined with years of battle and loss. His hair was iron gray, cropped close. A jagged scar ran from his temple to his jaw. Frank Miller. His eyes scanned the group quickly, sharp as a hawk's, landing on Rachel and the twins, before flicking to Logan. "You weren't exaggerating," he said in a gravelly voice. Logan gave a curt nod. "They need safety. You're the only one I trust." Frank's gaze softened barely as it settled on Rachel. "Get inside before you freeze." Rachel hesitated for half a second, then stepped into the warmth of the cabin. The smell of pine smoke and oiled steel filled her senses. The place was Spartan, but solid walls lined with weapon racks, shelves stocked with supplies maps, tacked to a heavy wooden table in the center. Frank shut the door behind them, bolting 3 different locks before turning back. "So Cross finally sent the wolves." "He sent worse," Logan replied, shrugging off his pack. "We need gear and a plan." Frank's eyes flicked toward Rachel again. "And she needs to learn to stop being prey." Rachel stiffened, clutching the twins closer. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "I'm not prey." Frank's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Good. Then let's make sure Cross learns that too." Within an hour, the cabin had shifted from sanctuary to war room. Logan spread maps across the table, marking routes and choke points with a thick black pen. Frank unlocked a steel trunk, pulling out rifles, handguns, boxes of ammunition. Rachel sat near the fire, the twins nestled in a cradle Frank had hastily put together from spare wood. She watched the men move with precision, their every gesture echoing a lifetime of combat. A part of her felt like an intruder, a fragile piece of glass in a room of stone. But then Logan's eyes met hers, across the fire. He didn't need to speak. She could see it in his gaze. "You're part of this now." Later, when the twins had finally fallen asleep, Frank set a pistol on the table in front of Rachel. Her breath caught. First time for everything," Frank said simply. "You want them safe, you learn. Otherwise, you're just waiting for someone else to save you." Rachel's hands trembled as she picked it up. The weight shocked her. It felt heavier than she'd imagined, heavier than the fear already pressing down on her chest. Logan stepped beside her, his voice steady and calm. "Breathe. Don't think about what it is, just think about what it's for." Rachel swallowed hard, gripping the weapon tighter. "For them," she whispered, glancing at her children. Logan nodded once. "Exactly." Frank handed her a spare clip. "Load it." Her fingers fumbled, at first clumsy with nerves, but she forced herself to focus. Each click echoed louder than the last, until finally the magazine slid into place. "Good," Frank said. "Now aim." Rachel raised the pistol with both hands, arms trembling, eyes locked on the wooden target Frank had set up across the room. "Steady," Logan murmured, stepping close enough for his voice to steady her pulse. "Don't rush. Just breathe." She squeezed the trigger. The crack split the cabin. The bullet buried itself in the target's edge just shy of center. Rachel flinched, then looked at the hole with wide eyes. Frank gave a short grunt. "Not bad. You'll get better." Logan's mouth tugged into the faintest smile. "Told you. Not prey." Rachel lowered the gun slowly, her breath shaky, but her eyes steadier than before. For the first time since the nightmare began, she didn't feel powerless. That night, after Frank had retreated to the watchtower and the twins were asleep, the cabin grew quiet. The storm outside whispered against the walls softer now, as though the mountain itself had decided to grant them a brief reprieve. Rachel sat near the fire, staring into the flames. Her body ached. Her mind felt stretched thin, but her eyes carried a new steel. Logan sat across from her, his features carved in shadow and firelight. For a long while, they didn't speak. Finally, Rachel's voice broke the silence, soft but steady. "When I was in that car, holding them praying, I thought maybe we wouldn't make it. I thought God had stopped listening." Logan's gaze lifted his storm-gray eyes, meeting hers. "And now?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, then gave a small, fragile smile. "Now I think maybe he sent you." The words hit him harder than a bullet. Logan's throat tightened, but he didn't look away. "I don't know if I believe in that anymore," he admitted, his voice rough. Rachel leaned closer, her eyes searching his. "Maybe you don't have to. Maybe you just have to believe in us, right here, right now." The fire cracked softly between them, sending sparks into the air. Logan reached across the table slowly, his hand brushing hers. Her fingers trembled but didn't pull away. In that moment, amidst the silence of the storm and the flicker of firelight, something fragile but undeniable took root. Not love, not yet, but trust. The kind that could change everything. Outside, the mountain winds carried whispers of danger, still lurking in the valley below. But inside Frank Miller's fortress, for the first time in days, there was warmth, not just from the fire, but from the fragile hope of two broken souls beginning to believe again. The night descended heavy and merciless, the storm roaring like a living beast outside Frank Miller's mountain stronghold. Snow whipped sideways, rattling against the reinforced shutters. The winds howled through the pine ridges, masking the sounds of movement just beyond the tree line. But Logan Hart's instincts didn't need the silence to tell him. "They're coming," he said flatly, his eyes narrowing as he checked the last of the ammunition clips on the table. Frank crouched near the window slit, adjusted the scope on his rifle. "I counted at least 8 heat signatures moving in. Could be more strung out along the ridge. Cross isn't wasting time." Rachel sat near the hearth, her arms wrapped tight around Ava and Aiden, who slept restless and oblivious in the cradle. Her face was pale, her chest rising and falling in shallow, terrified breaths. Logan crossed the room, crouching before her, Rachel. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and shimmering with fear. "You need to remember everything Frank showed you earlier," he said softly, pressing a small pistol into her trembling hands. "If anyone breaches that door, you shoot. Don't hesitate." Her throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. "I can't." "Yes, you can." Logan cut in firmly, his gaze holding hers. "Because it's not about you, it's about them." He glanced at the twins. "You're their shield." Something steadied in her then. Her grip tightened around the weapon, and her chin lifted just enough. "I'll protect them," she whispered. Logan gave a brief nod. "Good." From the shadows, Harry padded silently to her side, pressing his massive frame against her legs. The dog's golden eyes glinted with quiet ferocity. His ears pricked for the faintest sound. Frank's voice broke the tension. "We set the traps. Tripwire at the east approach pressure plates by the rear gate. Claymores rigged under the drift." Logan's jaw clenched. They won't expect this place to bite back. The storm howled again, rattling the door. Then faintly the crunch of boots on snow. Frank's hand tightened on his rifle. Positions. Logan moved to the front window slit, his body pressed low. His breath-slowed eyes scanning the swirling white. The shadows between the trees thickened, and then they emerged. Dark figures hunched against the storm rifles, slung helmets glistening with ice. Daniel's men. Rachel's heart lurched into her throat. She pressed the twins tighter against her chest, whispering a prayer. Then the first shot cracked through the night. A flash from the ridge, the bullet sparking off the metal shutters. Frank responded instantly, his rifle barking once clean and controlled. One of the shadows crumpled into the snow. Chaos exploded. Gunfire ripped through the storm flashes, lighting up the white like thunder in a blizzard. Bullets pinged against the cabin walls. Shards of wood flew from the shutters. Down, Logan barked, throwing himself beside Rachel, shielding her as a round smashed through the window frame. Harry barked savagely, teeth bared, ears flat. Frank's voice boomed from the other side. 2 down, more flanking. Logan's eyes darted to the door. They'll breach any second. The tripwire outside snapped. An explosion thundered, snow and debris erupting in a violent spray. Screams cut through the storm. Logan used the moment. Stay here, he ordered Rachel, then darted to the back entrance with his rifle ready. Harry's ears twitched, and he suddenly bolted forward, snarling. Rachel gasped. Harry. The dog lunged toward the door just as it burst open, a man charging in with a shotgun raised. Harry collided with him mid-step, sinking his teeth deep into the man's arm. The gun fired wild, the blast shredding the ceiling beam instead of Rachel. The intruder roared, slamming Harry into the wall. The dog yelped, but didn't let go, jaws locked with feral determination. Rachel screamed, raising the pistol with trembling hands. Get away from him! She fired. The crack echoed like thunder. The man jerked backward, blood spraying against the wooden wall. He collapsed, motionless. Harry staggered back, his shoulder bleeding, his breath ragged. Rachel dropped to her knees beside him, sobs ripping from her throat. No, please. Harry nuzzled her hand, weakly tail-thumping once, before forcing himself to stand again. Even wounded, he pressed forward, planting himself between Rachel and the doorway. Logan burst back into the room, his rifle smoking sweat and snow streaking his face. He froze at the sight of blood on the floor. Rachel, you... She cut him off, her voice shaking but fierce. He came for us. Harry saved me. I shot him. For a split second, Logan's eyes softened, pride flickering through the storm of rage in his gaze. He nodded. Good girl. Another volley of bullets rained against the shutters. Frank shouted from the window slit. They're regrouping. We've got maybe a minute. And then over the gunfire, a voice rang out through the storm. Cold, sharp, familiar. Rachel. Her heart stopped. Rachel! The voice bellowed again, closer now. You can't hide from me forever. You belong to me. Rachel's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. She would know it anywhere. Daniel Cross. She stumbled to her feet, clutching the cradle instinctively. Her breath broke, her body trembling like a deer in a hunter's sights. Logan's jaw set, his eyes like steel as he stepped toward the doorway, rifle raised. The storm lit up briefly with a muzzle flash outside, illuminating a tall figure standing in the snow. Daniel. His face was cruel perfection, his smile cold as the blizzard itself. He took a slow step forward, his eyes locking on Rachel through the shattered doorway. Rachel, he said, his voice cutting through the storm like a knife. Come to me. Bring the children. End this, and no one else has to die. Rachel shook her head violently, tears spilling down her cheeks. Never. Daniel's expression hardened, the smile vanishing. His voice roared over the gunfire. They are mine. Logan moved in front of her, his shoulders squared the barrel of his rifle, unwavering. His voice was low, lethal. You'll never touch them again. The storm screamed around them, bullets still tearing through the night. Frank chambered another round, his eyes locked on the shadows moving closer through the trees. Rachel's heart thundered, her entire body quaking. But when she looked down at Harry, bleeding, trembling, yet still standing guard, something fierce ignited in her chest. She raised her pistol again, her grip steady now, her eyes burning with resolve. The final battle had begun. The storm had become a living thing, clawing at the mountain with icy fingers tearing at the fortress walls. Snow swirled in violent spirals, the wind shrieking like 1,000 tortured voices. The night sky was a churning mass of white and shadow, the moon swallowed behind the storm's fury. Logan knew they couldn't stay inside. Daniel's men had breached the perimeter. Staying meant being trapped. Rachel, Logan shouted over the roar of the wind, his face cut with sweat and snow. Take the twins. Get to the ridge. Frank will cover you. Rachel's arms tightened around the cradle, her chest heaving. What about you? Logan's eyes were steel. I'll stop him. Frank grabbed a rifle, his grizzled face grim. I'll hold off the rest." Rachel wanted to argue, but the look in Logan's eyes silenced her. It wasn't bravado. It was a vow. They burst into the night, the storm slashing at their faces. Harry pushed forward, limping but relentless, his breath steaming like smoke in the frozen air. Then a shout ripped through the blizzard. "Rachel!" Her blood froze. Daniel Cross stepped out from the shadows at the ridge's edge, the storm whipping his coat like a dark banner. His men spread wide, forming a tightening arc. But Daniel's eyes were fixed only on her. He smiled a predator's smile. "You can run to the ends of the earth, Rachel, and I'll still find you." Logan pushed her behind him, raising his rifle. "Not tonight." The storm roared as the two men locked eyes. Years of pain, betrayal, and rage condensed into a single moment. Daniel tilted his head, his grin widening. "You think you can protect her? Protect them? You couldn't even save your own family." The words sliced deep, cruel, and deliberate. Logan's jaw clenched, but his rifle stayed steady. "Differences," Logan growled. "I won't fail again." A sudden crack of gunfire shattered the standoff. Frank fired from the flank, dropping one of Daniel's men. Chaos erupted, shouts, flashes, the smell of gunpowder carried on the freezing air. Logan charged. Daniel dodged left, their bodies colliding like rams on the snowy cliffside. The rifle went skidding into the drifts. Logan swung his fist, slamming into Daniel's jaw. Daniel staggered, but retaliated, driving his elbow into Logan's ribs. They grappled viciously, the storm howling around them, their boots sliding on the icy rock. Rachel crouched near the cradle, clutching the pistol Logan had given her. Her hands trembled violently as one of Daniel's men broke from the chaos and lunged toward her. "No," she screamed, raising the weapon. She fired. The shot rang sharp through the storm. The man jerked back, falling into the snow with a strangled cry. Ava whimpered. Aiden stirred. Rachel's tears froze on her cheeks, but her grip on the pistol didn't falter this time. Another shadow loomed from the side. She gasped, but Harry was faster. The dog hurled himself into the attacker, teeth sinking deep into the man's arm. The two crashed into the snow, thrashing. The man slashed with a knife, the blade grazing Harry's shoulder, blood staining his fur. Rachel screamed, raising the pistol again, but Logan's voice cut through. "Rachel, don't. He's got it." Harry twisted, savagely ripping the knife free, his growl thunderous even against the storm. The attacker shrieked, stumbling back into the white. Rachel dropped to her knees beside Harry, sobbing, her hands pressing to his bleeding shoulder. "Stay with me, boy. Please." But Harry shoved himself upright again, panting eyes blazing with undying loyalty. He stood between her and danger, blood dripping into the snow like crimson fire. Meanwhile, Logan and Daniel's fight had spiraled toward the edge of the ridge. Their boots carved trenches into the ice, their fists raw and bloody. Logan slammed Daniel into a jagged rock, snow exploding around them. Daniel roared, wrenching free and slamming Logan back with a brutal kick. Logan skidded toward the edge, his boots scraping the abyss yawning below. Rachel cried out, "Logan!" Daniel stalked forward, his chest-heaving eyes blazing with triumph. "This ends now," he spat, reaching for the knife at his belt. Logan staggered to his feet, blood on his lip, his breath harsh in the frozen air. He squared his shoulders. "You're right. It does." Daniel lunged, the blade flashing. Logan twisted, their bodies colliding again, hands grappling for the weapon. The storm whipped around them, snow swirling like ghosts of the dead. For a moment, the knife hovered between them, inches from Logan's chest. Daniel snarled, pressing down with all his strength. "You can't win, Hart. You're already broken." Logan's eyes burned, his voice low and fierce. "Broken doesn't mean beaten." With a surge of strength, he shoved upward, twisting Daniel's wrist. The knife clattered to the ground. Logan drove his shoulder into Daniel's chest, forcing him back toward the edge. Daniel's boots slipped on the ice. He flailed, grabbing at Logan's jacket. For a terrifying second, both men teetered over the abyss. Rachel screamed, clutching the twins to her chest. Harry barked savagely, blood spraying from his wound. Daniel's face twisted with fury. "If I go, I'll take you with me." Logan's muscles strained, veins standing out against his skin. He ripped free, slamming his fist into Daniel's jaw. Once, twice. The third time cracked bone. Daniel's grip broke. His eyes widened in shock, his mouth opening in a wordless snarl. And then he was gone. He fell backward into the abyss, his scream tearing through the storm as his body vanished into the swirling white. Silence followed. Only the storm's wail remained. Logan staggered, chest-heaving, staring at the void below. His hands shook with exhaustion, blood streaking his knuckles. Rachel ran to him. Tears streaming, the twins clutched tightly against her. She pressed against him, her sobs muffled in his chest. "It's over. It's finally over." Logan's arms wrapped around her, pulling her close, his forehead pressing to hers. He couldn't speak. He didn't trust his voice not to break. Harry limped toward them, his tail wagging weakly despite the blood staining his fur. Logan crouched, pulling the dog close, whispering hoarsely, "Good boy. You saved them." The three of them knelt together on the snowy ridge, Logan, Rachel, and Harry, while the storm raged on, carrying Daniel Cross's last scream into the void. For the first time in years, Logan felt the faintest glimmer of peace. The battle was won. But the war for healing had only just begun. The storm had finally begun to die, its furious howls retreating into the distance like a wounded beast slinking away to its den. But the mountain ridge remained brutal and unforgiving, draped in white silence that seemed to pulse with the echoes of the fight. The snow beneath their feet was stained dark, the red blooming like ink spilled across a white page. Rachel Moore's arms trembled as she clutched her children against her chest. Ava whimpered softly. Aiden stirred with a weak cry, their tiny breaths misting into the cold air. But Rachel barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on Logan Hart. He was down on one knee. His broad shoulders hunched his chest, heaving violently with each breath. Blood seeped through his jacket, spreading in a cruel, widening stain across his ribs. His face, pale beneath the smudges of snow and dirt, was lined with pain. "Logan!" Rachel's voice broke, splintering with terror. She dropped to the ground beside him, her free hand fumbling to press against the wound. Warmth spread instantly across her fingers, too much warmth in the freezing night. He flinched, his jaw tightening. It's nothing. Don't you dare say that." Her tears froze on her cheeks before they could fall, but her sobs broke through the stillness. "You can't, Logan, you can't leave us. Not now. Not after all this." He lifted his gaze slowly, his storm-gray eyes finding hers. Even through the haze of pain, there was gentleness there, a steadiness that rooted her against the hurricane of fear, threatening to consume her. "You're safe," he whispered, his voice rasping, frayed, like the edge of a torn flag. "That's all that matters." "No," Rachel cried, clutching him tighter as the twins whimpered in her arms. "You matter. Don't you understand? We need you. I need you." Beside them, Harry limped forward through the snow, each step heavy, his massive frame trembling from blood loss and exhaustion. He lowered himself to the ground with effort, his fur matted where the knife had cut deep, his breathing shallow. And yet, with the last of his strength, he nudged his muzzle against Logan's thigh, then rested his great head across his lap. Rachel broke at the sight, a sob tearing free from her chest. No, please, not both of you." Logan managed a faint, broken smile, his hand trembling as it stroked Harry's head. "Good boy," he murmured, his voice so soft she had to lean close to hear. You always knew when I needed you." Harry's eyes fluttered half-closed, but his tail gave the faintest thump against the snow, a defiant rhythm against the silence. Rachel pressed both her children closer, then turned back to Logan, panic rising in her throat like a tide. She could see the way his breaths came shorter, the color draining from his lips. The world around her blurred, the storm's dying echoes fading to nothing but the frantic pounding of her own heartbeat. "Stay with me," she begged, her voice cracking as she cupped his face with one trembling hand. "Please, Logan. You promised. You promised you'd protect us. You can't keep that promise if you're gone." He drew in a shallow breath, wincing as his chest rose. Then, with a strength that defied the weakness in his body, he lifted his gaze again. His eyes, clouded with pain, still held a clarity that cut straight into her soul. "You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever," he said, his voice faint, but sure. Rachel shook her head fiercely, her tears dripping onto his jacket. "Don't talk like that. Please don't say goodbye." He reached up his hand, cold and trembling, and brushed the back of his fingers across her cheek. "Rachel, before tonight I was a man with nothing, just a shadow walking through the snow. But you and those little ones, and Harry..." His eyes flicked to the loyal dog at his side, then back to her. "You gave me a family again." Her breath caught her chest, aching with the force of her sobs. "I don't deserve it," he whispered, his eyelids heavy. "But God gave me a second chance through you." Rachel leaned closer, her forehead pressing against his. "Then don't you dare waste it. Don't you dare leave us, Logan Hart. I can't do this without you." The twins stirred again, Ava letting out a soft cry that pierced the frozen night. Logan's lips curved in the faintest smile at the sound. He closed his eyes briefly, as if memorizing it. "That's what I was meant to hear," he breathed. Rachel's panic surged. She pressed harder against his wound, desperate. No, stay with me. Listen to her, listen to them. They need you, Logan. I need you." Frank's voice cut through the storm's lingering moans, urgent and gruff. He appeared from the shadows, rifle still in his hands, his face pale with the strain of battle. "We need to move him inside now. The bleeding won't stop out here." Rachel whipped her head toward him, her eyes wild. "Help me, please. Help him." Frank knelt, his weathered hands pressing firm against the wound. Logan gasped, but didn't cry out. Frank's jaw tightened. "It's bad. He's lost a lot of blood. It's a lot." Rachel's heart plummeted, but she refused to hear the defeat in his tone. "Then stop it. Save him." Frank looked into her eyes, seeing the fire there, the desperate strength of a woman who had already lost too much. He nodded once firm. "We'll do everything. We'll do." Between the two of them, they managed to lift Logan, his weight heavy, but not unbearable. Harry rose weakly, staggering to his paws to follow, refusing to be left behind. Blood dotted the snow in their wake, a grim trail leading back toward the cabin's glow. Inside, the warmth of the fire greeted them, but it felt fragile, like a candle flickering against the darkness, threatening to consume them all. Rachel laid Logan gently onto the rug by the hearth, her trembling hands brushing the hair back from his damp forehead. Frank worked quickly, pulling supplies from a battered first aid kit, gauze sutures, a bottle of antiseptic. Rachel hovered close, her heart in her throat with every shallow rise of Logan's chest. "Keep pressure here," Frank instructed, guiding her hand back to the wound. "Don't let up no matter what." She nodded frantically, her fingers trembling but steadying as she pressed down. Logan hissed, his body jolting. Rachel bent over him instantly, her lips close to his ear. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Just hold on." His eyes flickered open, finding hers again through the haze. A faint smile tugged at his lips. "Bossy," he rasped. Rachel let out a strangled laugh through her tears. "Then don't make me repeat myself." Frank stitched quickly, his hands moving with the precision of a soldier who had done this before in the worst of circumstances. But even he couldn't hide the tension in his jaw. Hours seemed to stretch within minutes, the storm outside fading into eerie silence. The twins had finally quieted, swaddled in quilts near the fire. Harry lay close, his head resting on his paws, his golden eyes watching every movement, though his body trembled with exhaustion. Rachel never once moved her hand from Logan's side. She never once looked away. At last, Frank sat back, exhaling hard. "The bleeding's controlled for now. He needs real care. A hospital. But he has a chance." Rachel's chest collapsed with a sob of relief. She lowered her head against Logan's chest, feeling the faint, steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. His arm shifted weakly, wrapping around her shoulders. "Told you," he whispered, his breath warm against her hair. "Not leaving." She lifted her head, her tear-streaked face inches from his. "Don't scare me like that again." He chuckled weakly, the sound fragile but real. "No promises." Rachel smiled through her tears, kissing his forehead gently. "Then I'll just stay right here to make sure." Outside, the mountain lay in silence, the storm spent the world blanketed in white, as though covering the scars of battle. But inside, by the warmth of the fire, a new beginning had taken root, not without wounds, not without cost, but real. Logan drifted into an exhausted sleep, his hand still gripping Rachel's. Harry, though bleeding and weary, shifted closer, laying his head across Logan's legs as if to guard him through the night. Rachel whispered softly, her voice breaking with both love and fear. "You and Harry, you gave me back hope. You gave me a family." And in the hush that followed as the fire crackled and the twins sighed in their dreams, it felt as though heaven itself leaned down to listen. The first rays of dawn spilled across Silver Creek, like brushstrokes of gold sliding over the snow-capped peaks and melting into the quiet valley below. The world that had once been cloaked in howling storms now breathed softly under the gentle touch of early spring. Snow still clung stubbornly to the pines glittering under the light, but patches of earth and green had begun to emerge, like hope breaking through the scars of winter. Rachel Moore stood at the kitchen window of the small log house that had, against all odds, become her home. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint crackle of the fire in the hearth. Behind her, Ava's laughter rang out, a bright musical sound that Rachel hadn't heard often enough in her children's young lives. Aiden cooed from the cradle, reaching up with tiny hands that grasped at the morning light as if he could hold it. Rachel turned her chest, swelling at the sight. Ava, still in her flannel pajamas, toddled across the rug, giggling as Harry patted behind her. The German shepherd moved with a grace that belied the scar along his shoulder, his golden eyes alert, tail wagging gently. The wound that had nearly cost him his life had healed well under Frank's careful tending. Though a faint limp remained, it hadn't stolen his spirit. "Easy," Harry, Rachel said softly, though her smile betrayed the warmth in her heart. "She thinks you're her big brother." The dog glanced up at her, as though he understood, then nudged Ava back toward the cradle. Rachel's eyes softened. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt the weight of fear begin to loosen its grip. Behind her, the creak of the wooden floor announced Logan's arrival. She turned her breath, catching at the sight of him. He stood in the doorway, his frame still broad, though thinner now, his face lined with exhaustion, but lit by a quiet strength. A bandage peeked from beneath his flannel shirt, wrapped snug around his ribs. His steps were slower, cautious, but steady. And in his eyes, the same storm-gray eyes that had once carried nothing but shadows, there was something new. Hope. Rachel set down the coffee mug and crossed the room quickly, her heart aching with both relief and fear. "You shouldn't be up yet," she chided softly, though her voice was thick with emotion. Logan gave a faint, crooked smile. "If I spend one more day in that bed, I'll forget how to walk." She reached for his arm, instinctively steadying him as he stepped closer. "You nearly died, Logan. You don't get to make jokes about it." His gaze softened as he looked down at her hand on his sleeve. "I'm not joking." He paused, his voice lowering. "I just couldn't stay lying down when there's this." He gestured toward the children. Ava was giggling now as Harry gently nudged her toy across the floor. Aiden gurgled happily from the cradle, kicking his small legs. The simple, perfect picture of life continuing despite the scars. Rachel followed his gaze, her throat tightening. She had dreamed of safety for her children, prayed for it through endless nights of running and fear. And somehow, impossibly, it was here. "We don't have to run anymore," she whispered, her eyes glistening. Logan's hand came up, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. "No," he agreed softly. "We don't." For a moment, the silence between them was thick, not with fear, but with something tender and unspoken. A recognition that though the war had scarred them both, it had also bound them together, in ways neither could have foreseen. Harry broke the quiet, with a sudden bark, sharp but cheerful, his tail thumping against the rug. Ava clapped her tiny hands, laughing at the sound, and Aiden cooed louder, as if joining the chorus. Logan lowered himself carefully onto the couch, wincing but refusing help. Rachel sat beside him, their shoulders brushing. Harry settled at their feet, laying his head across Logan's boots, like a sentinel unwilling to relinquish his post. Rachel turned to Logan, her voice trembling though steady with conviction. "When I was in that car, when I thought it was the end, I begged God for someone. Not for me, for them. I didn't care if I made it out. I just wanted them safe." Logan's eyes searched hers, his jaw tight. "I never thought he'd send a man with scars of his own," she continued softly, her hand brushing over his bandaged ribs, and a dog who fights like a soldier. Her lips curved faintly through her tears. "But he did." Logan swallowed hard, his throat working as he whispered, "Maybe." He knew only someone broken could understand what it means to protect something worth dying for. Rachel blinked back tears, her chest tight. "You didn't just protect us, Logan. You gave us a chance to live again." For the first time in years, Logan allowed himself a real smile, not faint, not weary, but genuine. "And you gave me a reason to." Outside, the first bird of spring sang faintly its song, carrying over the valley like a fragile promise. Rachel leaned closer, resting her head against his shoulder, the twins' soft breaths filling the room. Harry's steady warmth pressed against their feet. The world outside would still be dangerous. Daniel's empire might crumble, but shadows like his never disappeared overnight. Yet in this moment, surrounded by the family they had fought so hard to protect, Rachel felt something she had forgotten how to believe in. "Peace." She turned her head, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We're a family now, aren't we?" Logan exhaled slowly, the weight of the word sinking into him. Family. Something he had lost in flames 5 years ago. Something he had buried beneath duty and solitude. Something he had thought would never belong to him again. He looked at her, then at the children, then down at Harry, whose eyes blinked up at him with loyal devotion. And for the first time, he didn't feel like a man pretending to protect what wasn't his. He felt like he had finally come home. "Yes," he said softly, his arm curling around her shoulders. "We are." Rachel closed her eyes, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She whispered into the quiet, "Thank you." Logan pressed his lips to her hair, his own eyes damp though his voice stayed steady. "No, Rachel. Thank you." The sun climbed, higher, casting golden light through the cabin windows, painting the small room in warmth. Outside, the snow began to melt in slow rivulets, feeding the earth that had waited patiently beneath. Later that morning, they stepped onto the porch together. Logan leaned against the wooden rail, his bandaged ribs stiff but not painful enough to keep him inside. Rachel stood beside him, Ava perched on her hip, Aiden bundled safely in her arms. Harry sat at their feet, ears perked, his fur gleaming in the sunlight. The valley stretched before them, vast and quiet, the storm's scars already fading into the beauty of the landscape. Rachel turned her face to the light, her lips curving into a soft smile. "We don't have to run anymore." She repeated the words, carrying the weight of every sleepless night, every whispered prayer. Logan's eyes followed the horizon, but his hand found hers and squeezed gently. "No," he said, his voice low, steady. "We'll never run again." Harry barked once, sharp and proud, his tail sweeping the porch. Ava laughed, reaching out to pat his head. Aiden gurgled happily, his tiny fist clutching the edge of Rachel's coat. The four of them stood together, looking out over the horizon, as the dawn spread across the world like a blessing. And as the screen faded to light, a voice carried softly. "In the harshest storms, when hope seemed buried beneath the cold, love and courage lit a fire that no darkness could extinguish. And sometimes it is in the quiet after the storm that strangers become family." The final image lingered, Logan, Rachel, the twins, and Harry framed against the sunrise, the storm behind them, the future ahead. They were no longer running. They had arrived.